opportunity to become America's global mobility leader for Hewlett-Packard Enterprises. Since then, she's joined Fabric, a startup where she's Senior Director of People Operations today. Thanks so much for coming, Andrea, and we're glad you're
Thanks
here.
for having me.
Next, we have Ian Robinson, who's a partner in Fragomen's London office. Fragomen LLP is one of the leading law firms working in immigration services worldwide, where he focuses on UK immigration. Worked there in immigration for 15 years and manages a team that supports businesses across a variety of different sectors with their immigration needs. Thanks for joining us, Ian. And then finally, we have Scott Flicker, who's a partner in Deloitte's Global Employer Services area. With over 30 years of experience in entity employment and digital taxation, his work is now focused on global employer operations enable it, practicing primarily in tech and media industries, but is an innovation leader who emphasizes digital service transformation, ecosystem ventures in his market sector. Thanks for joining us, Scott.
Thank you, Bruce. Great to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's start with kind of the first question that'll help students really understand where each of you are coming from. So how did you end up in the position that you guys are each in? And what does your work look like on a day-to-day basis? Let's start with Andrea. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, sure. So I actually started in the mobility industry by accident. I was intending to go to law school after undergrad and decided I wanted to wait a year and earn some money. And needed a job, and my roommate's sister was a recruiter for Serva at the time. So that's literally how I ended up in this industry. But now fast forward a decade plus, I don't want to say exactly how long. Yeah, and I'm very fortunate to have ended up here in Fabric. I think what's been most exciting about my journey so far in transitioning from mobility into HR is it validates and confirms that many skills are transferable across all different types of work. Mobility is a very niche area. And many times, most individuals don't know about it unless you've had a family member relocate when you were a child or have relocated yourself. And so I think what's really exciting about the industry as part of a broader HR function is the ability to show that, having knowledge and expertise in this specific area does not limit yourself to that area as a whole for your entire career. So I ended up here at Fabric a couple months ago after having a couple roles since my last mobility role. And it's been really exciting to really take a lot of the skills that I developed while in mobility and place them in the operations space.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Thanks, Andrea. Ian, what about you?
Yeah, so I finished university about 20 years ago and wasn't quite sure what to do afterwards. I worked as a chef. I had various jobs, and then I saw a job advertised in government, and I'd been studying law and politics, and I went on to work and run the complaints unit for UK immigration for the government, and it was quite a hard job. It was quite a busy job. Led me on after a quick promotion to various policy jobs on family, on criminal policy, on victims policy, on economic policy, which is where I finished. And having spent 2 years in charge of the UK's economic migration policy, I was approached by Brendan Ryan, who at the time was our regional managing partner, and he offered me a job at Fragomen. And I made the call that as fun as working in government could be, I would get a lot more flexibility and a lot more scope to learn in the private sector. I had a bit of a shock 6 months in when I realised you can actually get fired if you work in the private sector rather than government. Hell of a lot harder to get fired in government, but it feels like that didn't happen, and it feels like it was a decent choice.
That's great. If I ever cook you dinner, I know who to call. Well, that's awesome to hear, Ian. Scott, what about you?
Well, I haven't thought about this for a long time. I would say I became an accountant by accident, and I got into mobility by design. So when I got out of college, I was part of a small entrepreneurial venture advertising company, and I was the only one with any accounting classes behind me. So I wound up doing all of the books and records, and ultimately figured out we had a partnership and read the rules and became super interested in tax. I went back to school, got a degree in accounting. My first efforts were actually in Chinese language and history, and then I wound up in public accounting. And once I was there, I started to do a lot of technical work, a lot of inbound entity technical work, but I was more interested in the employer compliance space and individual cross-border, anything international. I just am fascinated by the clash of cultures, the way things behave differently in different environments in different countries around the world, and I pursued that passion. I was lucky enough to be in an organization that had, a lot of opportunity. If you had an interest in something, you could raise your hand and over time engineer your career and head in that direction. Ultimately culminating in some work abroad. I lived in Asia for nearly 5 years, done a lot of work in India over the last 15 years in particular. And so I got to scratch that itch pretty well, yeah.
Yeah, been all over the globe. That's great to see. And I think what would be really interesting for our attendees to kind of see is how different each one of your positions are, because each one of you touch a very unique area of HR and global mobility. So I'll kick this off to whoever wants to grab it first. What does a day in your work look like? What do you do day to day in your position?
Would it help? I as it happens, if I were to go first, I've just taken a quick look at my diary for the week. And the reason I did that is because it will give you a sense of what a day looks like. But actually, my days are quite different. So when I looked through variously over the course of just this week, I've just actually got off a client meeting where I've been talking about their regional program, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And I've got various client conversations dotted around. Some of them on the UK, where I will be giving UK legal advice and thoughts. Some of them looking at global or regional program management. I've got a lot. I've just inherited or taken on a team of 8 new people. So I've got an awful lot of management matters to deal with, getting to know them, but also understanding what they want from their career so that we know how best to serve them, frankly. I've got quite a few meetings on business development and one RFP, which is a big pitch, which should be quite fun. I always enjoy the writing the story. What is it? Having spent the time listening to what the problem a person has, trying to work out what the solution is that we can sell to them, essentially to do what they need. I've got on Wednesday morning a meeting with the BBC, which is a big UK TV broadcaster. I've got various meetings this week with Talent Beyond Boundaries, which is a refugee charity, and another charity, several other charities actually, that are trying to understand and influence government direction on vulnerable migrants and vulnerable migration. That's not really something that we do commercially, but it ties into corporate social responsibility. I then have a meeting on training staff globally on how to price and how to charge for our services. I've got various meetings preparing for meetings with government. I have a lot of meetings, by the way, where I'm preparing for another meeting, or a meeting preparing to prepare for another meeting. I've got a couple of, and then I've got a meeting on technology and digitizing a particular process towards the end of the week, and a meeting with a think tank we hope will produce a paper for us on immigration in the UK. So I suppose my job is, it's a combination. The most important thing is looking after the people who work for you. Then it's looking after the clients that you have. Then it's bringing in new clients. And then it's the other interesting things like the media, government, charities, and so on. It's quite varied, really.
Love this approach, Ian. I'll play this game too. First of all, there was something you said that just made me smile. My long time ago, I brought my daughter to work just because she had a day off from school, and frankly, I needed to get into the high occupancy vehicle lane on the highway. So she came to work with me. And at the end of the day, she came back and her mom asked her, "So what does dad do all day?" And she says, "He talks on the phone." And then the follow-up question was, what does he talk about? She thought about it and she said, he talks about setting up another meeting so he can talk on the phone. So anyway, I agree with that. My week, aside from doing this, conversation about careers and mobility, includes discussing with an individual client who's a C-level executive about some personal individual income tax planning, mostly around contributing equity to a trust, to a charitable trust. So it's very individually focused. I've got several meetings this week as we work with a large tech company on figuring out the compliance programs around their future of work, not limited to just remote work, and also global in nature as well as state to state in the United States. I have a series of 2 labs where we're working with technology people in tax and throughout other areas of the firm to conceptualize our next move in terms of machine learning and robotic process automation of some of our workflow that we do in our particular business around global employer services. This is the time of year where we are submitting business cases for the promotion of some of our highest performing senior managers to managing director or to partner or principal, so to leadership roles. I have a couple people I'm sponsoring for that. So working with them on their business cases, et cetera. And I've got a couple of meetings with my regular clientele as just sort of pre-meetings a little bit as we move in towards year end. In our business around global employer services, at least at Deloitte, we do a lot of work with our clients in the payroll environment, getting things kind of cleaned up and trued up before the end of their reporting year. And of course, there are then fiscal year cycles that end in March and June, and we get involved with those as well. So early contact, what are you thinking? What's the scheduling? What are the payroll cutoffs? How can we help you gather the information? Do you have any questions, et cetera? The terrain is always moving on their obligations, so it's important to keep everybody up to speed.
All right, I will round us out then. So my day is, or my week, I would say a lot of it this week is all around implementations. So because we are a startup, I have a lot of fun every day building. So we really have an intense exploration period on many different things we're looking at. As an example, for 2 of them right now, we're in the middle of implementing an LMS, which is a learning management system, because we have no learning culture. So we had to start from the ground up with that, as well as also developing our first intranet, which admittedly is not something I've ever done before. So that's been pretty exciting to learn that new skill of how exactly you build an intranet, the governance around an intranet, who can post, who can't, what are the guardrails and differences between intranet and Slack. So all of those things are very exciting. Also prepping for 2 meetings in the next week with our CEO and CFO to round out what we hope to be our first human capital management system. As well as I'm also in charge of IT support, which is also very interesting and not something that anyone would normally think would fall into the people organization, but we like to do things a little bit differently here at a startup. So we're also going to be presenting to that same audience some enhancements and opportunities we can on the IT support and security side to be a little bit better. Also, we do have a bunch of, I'd say, culture meetings here as well. So again, because we are a startup, we are building our own culture, forming our own identity. And so as leadership, we are obligated and have a responsibility to help accelerate the message of our values. So we're hosting some sessions there around who we are as a company and analyzing every value that we have and understanding how it fits into our daily work. We have another confidential project that I can't discuss that is a very intense implementation and management of change that will be coming down very soon, as well as having some more exploration and tangible meetings regarding mergers and acquisitions. So there's a little flavor.
Different for everybody, yeah. No, that's great to hear. And I think it would be awesome to learn a little bit more about the areas that each of you work in. So let's start with Andrea here. You transitioned from one of the world's largest RMCs to working in global mobility at a large firm to a startup now. So what, in each kind of phase of career change, what was different in each area you worked in? And what do you think students can take away from that about the global mobility industry and HR industry as a whole?
Yeah, so I think for me, it was extremely important, and it turned out to be very valuable that I had over a decade of experience at an RMC before I moved over to the corporate side. So I would definitely encourage people to try and work both sides. At times, it's a little bit difficult to kind of jump, as I would say, overcoming something like that in and of itself actually was pretty exciting for me earlier in my career. But I felt having that view of what the vendor side is like is critically important, right? I get to know the good things and maybe some of the bad things at times, right? You get to see the wizard behind the curtain, but you also have I think a deeper breadth and understanding of the challenges on both sides. Servo really helped me build. I had a lot of excellent opportunities there. I was promoted quite a bit, had the opportunity to have all kinds of good experiences. And fundamentally what that left me with was I really enjoyed having the agility of a position. I didn't like being boxed in. And really one of the biggest decisions of moving to HPE to run the Americas program is we never had a view that our program was just about mobility. We always had the goal that we were more than that. We were not going to be a transactional team, simply taking people from A to B to Z. We really wanted to push the boundaries of what was possible with mobility. So with that came, an enhanced obligation and responsibility, as well as some creative thinking on what mobility can do for a Fortune 200 company like HPE, when we were a small team of less than 10, right? Relocating all these individuals around the world. So that was really exciting. And I think from what I gathered from HPE a lot was how to navigate within a large company, right? Servo was a mid-sized company, a couple thousand employees at the time. It was a great place to grow, but then you go into this beautiful machine that is Hewlett-Packard Enterprise and the decades of legacy that Hewlett-Packard had left us, and how to navigate through that, right? And also how to show, while there's great opportunities working for such a bigger company, right? You have the ability to go to different roles. I still felt I really had to prove myself to get out of mobility. And that was actually ultimately the goal, right? Not in a negative way, but I wanted to work for a company like HPE because I knew eventually I wanted to get to a better place, another place in my career where I wasn't staying in mobility for the entire time. So working at a big company like HPE allowed me to do that. I got exposed to all the different parts of HR, as well as the fact that they were actually amazing and helped to pay for my graduate degree. And when I went after my graduate degree, I intentionally did it in HR, right? It was a very purposeful move. And I did it in HR analytics and leadership, which was also a niche area because what mobility taught me is our analytics are everywhere, right? And we are a very data-driven society now. And you have to have data and you have to understand and translate data in order to get your point across. And so all of that then ultimately, brought me to those opportunities outside of mobility. And what it made me realize moving into more HR transformation space was I liked being able to build something. Being at HPE and really helping to incept the HR transformation office, this was something brand new for the company. And that really opened my eyes to be like, wow, I really like to build something from nothing. And so then a startup seemed like the next logical step, right? Because what better place can you build than at a place that really is coming from nothing and starting from the ground up? So that's really what led me here today. And it's really exciting. It's challenging, but I leave every day extremely exhausted, but in a good way.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you have very clearly a strategy there to transition from mobility to HR. Was it your desire to build something that led that drive? What was kind of your motivating factor there?
It was all about experiences, right? So, for failure of sounding, cliched, I wanted as many tools in my toolbox as I possibly could. So one thing I've always done in my career is I've never said no to any opportunity or project. At times others are more gratifying, right? You get a more self-fulfillment. But at the end of the day, I can tell you any project or initiative I've worked on, I've learned something new. I've encountered a new new challenge and I've become better. And that's been my motivation and my mantra since I was 22 and just leaving undergrad was I wouldn't say no to any opportunity. And I would find a way to, look at it in a fashion that I knew I could grow from it and go from here. So, coming from mid-market to large enterprise, now down to startup, it just felt like the next step of, sharpening those tools in my toolkit and getting some new ones to put in there as well.
Absolutely. I think that's a great lesson for graduates to be able to be opportunistic about what comes in front of them, 100%. And Ian, I would be really interested to hear as well how your time in government influenced your career at Fragomen, what you took away from working in government, what was different about the two approaches, and what students can learn from that path that you took.
Yeah, so when I must say, when I started in government, I was 23 or 24. And I quickly realized, I'm from a part of the UK, Liverpool, which you may know for the football or for the Beatles, for the football, especially this week. And when I started in government, it's quite a working class area. And I joined the Home Office and quickly felt like everybody spoke differently to me, used bigger words. One of my bravest moments was when I asked somebody to stop speaking Latin in a meeting because none of us understood him. Everyone dressed differently and so on. And I largely felt like I was part of someone else's club when I first started. What quickly became apparent was, and what I quickly learned was I had as much right as anyone to be there. And even those people who dressed better or spoke differently to how I spoke, didn't mean they were necessarily more capable than me. And that was a journey where I picked up an awful lot in terms of problem-solving skills, strategy skills, project management skills, drafting and communication, and so on. But it also helped me to build my confidence. Really importantly, it also helped me to get a clearer idea of what my values were and what mattered to me. The things that I would be proud when I told my mum and dad what I was doing in work, without wishing to make it too trite. Then I joined Fragomen. I joined Fragomen, as I said, because I thought it would be interesting and less constraining to work outside of government. But what I took with me from the Home Office was partly those communication skills. And in this, we sometimes talk about soft skills in quite a lazy sort of way, and communication is about more than how you present or how you write. But actually, a non-lawyer, and I'm a partner in a law firm despite not being a lawyer, a non-lawyer working in a law firm, it means that you don't have what your colleagues have, but it means that you also have something that they don't. It means that I write in a different way, I communicate in a different way, solve problems in a different way. It helped me on values and to anchor myself in the way that I thought people ought to be treated. It helped me to anchor myself in the way that I thought that problems should be solved. So looking back to the beginning rather than what just happens to be in front of you immediately. What it also allowed me to do, recognizing that I was never going to be as good a lawyer as the lawyers who were working for me, I decided I wasn't really going to ever try to be. My view tends to be there's a line above which we all have to be for certain competencies, and no one, if anyone ever tried to write down those competencies, you're going to miss them or misarticulate them. But actually, we all know what they are, and it comes down to the feedback that you get from your manager. Do what they tell you if they feel like you should be performing differently or better in a particular area. But once you've cleared that line, the most important thing is to be I suppose it's the best version of yourself, but work out what you're good at, work out what you're passionate about, what you enjoy, and will be better at than other people, and use that to push yourself on further. And it was only when I had left the Home Office and joined Fragomen that I realised that that's what my bosses had been doing for me. They hadn't been too worried about the areas where I wasn't too strong, because other people were good at that. It was always about be better at the things that you're already better at, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for a lot of students, we're all trying to figure out what our comparative advantage is in the workplace and trying to balance that with, you're a young kid moving into a new firm. you don't want to step on anybody's toes, and you want to find the right spot for you, right? So how do you balance that desire to determine what your strengths are with that desire to make sure that, you know, you're doing the job correctly, that you're fitting into the company without becoming too much of a conformist, still remaining true to what your strengths are? How did you find that balance early on in your career?
So the one thing I'd say is on the conformity and so on, if you need to be able to be yourself. I remember that one manager in my first job told me that I was too colloquial. So around our way, we say sound, which means good. And we say it a lot. She told me I needed to be less colloquial, less scouse. It's the area. My response to that, and I wouldn't necessarily endorse it, Scott and Andrea will tell me if I made a mistake here, but I became more scouse and more colloquial because I thought, sod you, I'm going to be myself. But actually, luckily that didn't stand against me. You always need to be careful with those things, but equally, if you can't be yourself in the workplace, you need to find a different workplace. It would be very, very tiring spending your working day being somebody else. But ultimately, in that first graduate job, what I'm looking for is somebody who looks interested, somebody who listens, somebody who, if they don't have the answer, that's okay. They ask. I'm very aware that if I'm saying something out loud for the first time, I don't know what I'm saying, so I can't necessarily expect the person I'm listening to fully understand it. So ask those questions and so on. And in that first graduate job, you are going to distinguish yourself by being good at the job that's in front of you, for having listened, done as you're told, and delivered what's needed. As you become more senior, it becomes easier to add your own flourishes. And Scott, Andrea, and I all went through our day-to-day jobs. All we're doing is solving problems. Generally speaking, with other people executing them, but we will do. It's boring if you're only ever solving them and you don't get to fix them. But you are, at the beginning, somebody else is trying to solve a problem. You're making their life easier by doing what they ask you to get that problem sorted. And that may feel quite constraining, but that's how you learn and begin to form opinions and begin to offer the sort of value that I was slightly nervous about offering, certainly when I started in the Home Office. I don't know, Andrea and Scott, is that fair, do you think? I'm worried about giving advice to 70 graduates that might be wrong.
No, I agree with that. You know, I had somebody once as well who she best of intentions, but described me as having sharp elbows. And I said, well, my sharp elbows help me succeed in getting my clients what they need. So I'll take my sharp elbows any day of the week if it gets the job done. So completely agree. I kind of rebelled against what was, you know, something that I guess at that time someone found a detriment in me as, but I saw it as an asset because I could fight for my clients and what they needed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with, I mean, there's been so much really rich coaching that's just been shared by Andrea and Ian. I don't know what more to add. I will emphasize one or two things and maybe add my own story briefly. One is Andrea's journey. Well, first of all, the comment about being, you know, in our business and in business in general. You can be at a company, you can be at an advisor or a provider or a supplier. Understanding those relationships from the inside out by working on both sides of that fence or all sides of those fences they're really helpful. I mean, I say that although, you know, I have 13 years with Arthur Andersen and 19 years with Deloitte, essentially is one career without having jumped the fence at all. Although I did spend a couple of years essentially on loan staff to Bankers Trust and then Deutsche Bank around the late 90s and early 2000s. Richest part of my career. I learned more, I learned so much. And more importantly, people who, I've had people on my team who've left and gone to work for a client and then come back and they're different. They just understand things differently. Except that we could talk more about that if anyone wants to ask a question as to what are the phenomenon at work there. But that's great advice right there. Don't be afraid to own your career, even if it means making a tough decision, changing a department, changing a job. It's your career, right? Deloitte doesn't own it or any of these companies. It's your career. And in that regard, Ian's advice ties very neatly to that. you will be far more successful and importantly, happy if you are yourself when you're at work. And there will always be people at work and in life who, comment on who you are and the way you are and all of that. And that's okay. Well, they can comment, but that's them talking, that's still not you. So you need to filter what of that communication is valuable for you and what you're going to learn, and how then you're going to take it forward. For myself, my career arc, I mentioned earlier, it was sort of accounting by accident, mobility by design. I definitely engineered myself into this space. And I would say when I look back on those 30 years, every 5 years is, from a content standpoint, pretty different. Both in terms of the stage I was in my career and how I interacted with people around me, and then the content of it, the kind of work that I did. If you're committed, I'll go back to something that Ian said as well. It's not just when you're hired that we look for that level of passion, commitment, intent, et cetera. That's a premium over technical knowledge. We don't expect you to be a technician when you're kind of fresh in the door. But that passion, you got to keep bringing it. That's okay. We expect you over time to acquire certain technical skills, the ability, for example, as Andrea was talking about, to manage integrations and implementations, or to work through some due diligence, on a corporate transaction and do her share of it, et cetera. Yes, that experience becomes important and more vital, but passion's always important. Intent is always important. And I don't think that ever, you should ever let that wane. And if you catch yourself, being bored at work or not being interested to make the drive into work, that's a sign. And you should be thinking, and you should be, talking to the people you trust at work and your other people you trust in your life to figure out what to do next. But you can be deliberate about engineering your progression. And again, I was successful at that. I moved from a lot of partnership and real estate work over into employer and complex individual work over time. I spent a lot of time, I was super fascinated by financial services for a while, spent some years in that industry, then moved over to tech. And I've been essentially in tech and media for the last 15 years, and I love it. I find it to be super dynamic and very, very challenging. And I've also moved away. A much smaller portion of my workload is client service now. A lot of it is project, it's innovation work, and it's ecosystem and alliance work, looking for opportunities to develop in the marketplace. And I spend more and more time investing in the people around me, because I find that very gratifying. And for some reason that's unexplained to me, people like for me to be their coach. So it works out.
Yeah, no, I think that's great to hear. And Scott, you bring a great perspective to the table here, having worked in the same area for quite a while, but having a variety of different experiences throughout that, including a lot of different international experiences, as well as experiences in tons of different sectors. So when you're trying to analyze those different opportunities that are available, how do you decide whether or not to kind of stay and build your strengths in one area versus go and explore something totally new?
That's a wonderful question. I acknowledge that maybe in the last few minutes that I was talking, you could get the impression that you should always and only choose the things that, really attract you. And, you should, but you have to develop your strengths. You have to invest in yourself. Some of the best learning I've ever done started off as really tedious work, plotting my way through depreciation schedules and building tax balance sheets, as part of transaction work. But you've got to lean in and do it. Matter of fact, my first job, I was an auditor for the Air Force for a couple of years when I went back to school to get my accounting degree. And I took the job because it just worked really well with my schedule. and I did 3 rotations with the Air Force, full-time work. And it was tedious work. It's very careful writing when you write an audit report. It's lots of note-taking when you're interviewing people to understand. The Air Force doesn't do financial statement work. They do audits of economy and efficiency. So you're looking at process efficiency and whether or not you're achieving mission and things like that. It can be very laborious, but those 2 years were gold for me in terms of experience. I have technical writing skills because of that experience. I have the patience to go through the facts and double click on stuff and corroborate detail when I need to. Those are skills you don't just magically acquire. Habits, great business habits. You got to invest in yourself and you got to do it. So I would say that if it feels like a skill set is fundamental to the direction that you're going in, stay in that role for a bit. Don't stay too long so that you get bored, but stay in long enough. You have to find that balance between your enthusiasm and your anxiousness and your need to develop yourself. And if you're open and you're in communication with a good coach and a mentor, they will help you figure that out. So maybe that's the other really important lesson about a career. It is your career, but you don't have to do it on your own.
Absolutely. And I think that's great advice, especially for students about to enter the workforce, to not think about, jumping around or thinking way down the road, but to really focus, what can you develop now and who can help you develop that skill? I think that's phenomenal. So kind of shifting gears for a second to talk more about global mobility and the HR industry as a whole, I think students would be really interested to hear y'all's perspective on some of the big changes we're seeing in 2021, especially post-COVID, with far more workers resigning and refusing to come back into the workforce and demanding more from their employers, with the rise of work from home and remote work, and then companies trying to reshift the way they even think about work as well, with every company now seems like having a significant future of work initiative that they're trying to build. What do each of you see as kind of the most impactful changes in human resources now in the 21st century, now in 2021, that you think will be long lasting, that aren't trends, but are here to stay? And I'd love to see each of your perspectives on this. So I'll throw it out to the crowd.
I can go on this one first. I think for me, there's been a lot of talk over the last couple of years of all the generations in the workforce, right? So I think that is, here to stay as well. That, we'll continue to have so many generations crossing one another and finding different ways of working together. I think for me, especially with a startup that was essentially came to be during a pandemic, we are truly a global company whereby we find the best talent, and we have the opportunity to do that because as of now, we don't have an obligation of anyone going into an office, right? We have some, shared spaces in our, top countries, but, we've allowed to structure ourselves in a way from a compliance perspective that allows us to seek truly the best talent around the globe without putting ourselves at risk. From a PE perspective or as well as an immigration perspective. So we've been very purposeful in that approach as well, knowing what we know about the inherent risks if you're non-compliant in those spaces. So that's been particularly intriguing. I think having that kind of inherent flexibility in our DNA has allowed us to accelerate our talent, has allowed us to find the best and brightest that we want, as well as assuming, again, they're the right culture fit for us. So, I am of the opinion that flexible work is here to stay. I just can't see companies going back to exactly the way we had it, where there'll be where there will be elements of return, because I do think there will be. I think all of us workers have gotten to this point of this flexibility is a necessity, I think, in order for, for individuals to feel at their highest performance. And so really what that comes down to is, how do you prefer to work? Where do you prefer to work? And, how can companies be agile enough to support you around that regard, right? I'm certainly not advocating, as Ian would attest to, allowing people to work wherever they want. You have to be compliant from a global immigration perspective, of course, but just having that ability to, be able to pick up my laptop and, take my son to a baseball, lesson and still be able to work from there, right? Being able to, go and see my family back home for a week and be able to work from there, right? That's a game changer, I think, as life has it. And to me, at least from my perspective, it really helps me to be a better employee and helps me to be a better parent as well. So I'd say, to me, those things are not changing. I think they will be here to stay. And now a bit, it's up to the responsibility of the companies to find a right infrastructure and balance to support compliance, but also support employees as they go.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go for it. Ian. I would love to kind of hear your perspective on that, especially about how companies are ensuring employees are remaining compliant, which is one of the questions that was sent in to us as well.
Yeah, so well, I think there's to me the trend. I mean, the if you go back to the beginning, the first principles, the starting point is that there is a surge in demand for goods and services after the pandemic. There are global skills shortages, and then we have the Great Resignation. You're feeling it more in the US than we would feel it in the UK and Europe more generally, but it's growing, and it feels even in the UK and Europe it could be coming at a reasonable pace in Europe, if you believe, as I do, labour market analysis. So the trend in HR is, it's how do you get people and how do you keep them? And when you're thinking about that, you're thinking from a compliance perspective. How do you do this compliantly with employment law, with immigration law, as Andrea said, people who want to work from anywhere and so on, tax and so on, and of course, COVID regulations. So it's compliance, but it's also employee experience. It's a job seekers market at the moment. How do you make sure, especially the brightest and best people, that you're the firm that they want to work for? And that's where it's going. And if you look at that from this, through this mobility lens and the job that Scott and I do, and Andrea's been part of too, it's essentially, how can you make mobility a tool that benefits recruitment, retention, and also productivity, because happy people are productive. You then consider that in view of the people you're looking to hire, or for mobility looking to move, and they will variously. Some will be nonplussed, of course, but a good portion will be anxious about moving, anxious about the country that they've moved to and never been able to step outside because of lockdowns, anxious about what it means for their family, anxious about, do we stay, do we go, will we be locked in again? But you'll also have people with itchy feet who are thinking, I've spent the last 18 months sat on a couch working from my laptop in a living room with 5 housemates. I want to be out of here. Where can I go? And then it's about making sure that you have policies that recognize how people can feel, all through a commercially sustainable lens, and that you're helping people. How many of your assignees miss their mum and dad because they haven't seen them because they haven't been able to travel home for a year and a half? How many of your assignees move to, I don't know, Rome, wanting to live a beautiful, romantic Italian lifestyle in the countryside, eating meatballs outside big cathedrals? I don't know what they would be called, but then haven't been able to leave their flat. What are their options, and how are you making information available to them? They shouldn't have to spend their evenings Googling. They shouldn't have to spend their evenings looking back at the emails that Scott or I sent to them 3-4 years ago, or rather that our team sent to them. How can we make them feel valued and remove that anxiety? And a big part of it is providing information. So much of life is just about helping people understand the world that they're occupying at that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you kind of underlie a little bit of, the dark side of work from home, and probably one of the things that might be leading to this great resignation trend we're seeing, which is you can take work everywhere with you, which is benefits, but then work follows you everywhere, which is downsides.
Yeah.
And I would be interested to hear, Scott, and I think you would provide a good perspective on this, but from Ian, Scott, whoever wants to jump on this, how are companies kind of managing both the upsides of increased flexibility, people can travel, people can run their errands during the middle of the day if they need to do as they wish, with the potential downside of productivity, which I know is a mixed bag in both areas, as well as kind of burnout from an employee perspective of I'm, working on my couch every night instead of leaving my work at the office, right? So how have companies been managing kind of the pros and the cons, especially larger companies that have a workforce that probably likes both sides of it?
Question, by the way, Italian for meatball, I believe, is polpetta. So before I'll address that question in a minute, I just want to sum up, because there's a part of answering that question that's important. When the world changes, as it did, right? I mean, pre-pandemic, the number of employees that worked remotely was in the low single digits, at least according to the OLS, Organizational Labor Statistics, and OECD. It was extremely small. To Andrea's point and Deanne's point, that's all going to change. None of us, I think, on the call can imagine remote work being at 3% going forward. I don't know what it's going to be, but it's going to be a lot bigger than 3%. When the world shifts like that, it went that way as out of necessity, but then now the genie's out of the bottle and people know that they can still be productive from a distance, right? We've been able to be productive from a distance for a long time, and some professions excel at that, but now it's kind of seeped into a lot of professions, a lot of industries. When it comes to reacting to like a shift like that, people react first and immediately. Companies and organizations are a bit slower, and governments tend to be the slowest. So what's interesting, I think, about having the three of us on the line here, and Bruce's question about, what are companies doing, or what can they do to sort out to detension the environment and to get people to maintain some level of compliance, to do the things that they're supposed to do as an employer vis-a-vis their people, their workers, and kind of correct for the misalignment that exists now as a result of remote work. Let's not forget, governments are soon to follow, right? And they're working on the problem now. And many governments reacted during COVID-19 with specific COVID-19 relief, but there's a long-term adjustment for governments to think of as well. People are reacting. Our clients, Andrea's company, are reacting now behind the curve, and then governments will come after that. And when you think about, for all of you looking for where to go and what's interesting for you to do, all of this that we're talking about will take years and years to play out. This is not a correction that the world is going to be able to kind of adjust to very, very quickly. There are some things we can do quickly, but remember, the whole cycle happens again. Once governments actually make their adjustments, we come back, everyone comes back and readjusts as part of the iteration. The work, to Bruce's wonderful question, there are, it's kind of like a golf swing. There's like 9 things you have to do absolutely perfectly to land the ball where you want it to. This is that complicated, right? There are breakdowns now in the way we engage with people. My number one, the one thing that keeps me up at night is, and there's a lot, actually I sleep very well. There's not much that keeps me up at night. But one thing I do think about are new hires and interns and what's their experience. How are they experiencing the company culture? Who are they making connections with? And how difficult is that to do? I'm a little old-fashioned. I have a hard time feeling that I can connect the same way virtually than I can if we spend a week together, in a boot camp doing training and, hanging out during the breaks and getting to know one another. There is an important informality and social element to your career. At least there was to my career, which creates commitment, which creates You're not in the lifeboat alone mentality, which creates, you know, I want to do something for you because I know who you are, not because there's something in it for me. When you lose that, that is some of the stuff that makes teams great, that makes companies great. I worry about an entire generation of recruits coming in, and how do we replace something like that? Now, that's an extreme example of the engagement problem, but there are a lot of things in between, you know, that and other normal engagement. Like, how do I measure performance? How do I keep people processed? How do I keep them informed? Are they really paying attention when I have a company meeting or a team meeting, or are they multitasking? All of these are things that we have to solve for. We can assume positive intent, but we have to assume also that it's going to be harder to do in a virtual environment. Compliance is harder to do in a virtual environment. How many people really updated their address in whatever, you know, human capital management system is there? You know, I know people who spent 2 months last winter in Colorado skiing in, you know, in a rented cabin in Breckenridge. And I asked them just as much, you know, did you tell anybody you were doing that at the company? No, why would they care? I'm still on Zoom every day. That's potentially a compliance issue. Not to mention, I know all the things that keeps, I don't know, all the things that keeps swirling around Ian's head about this problem. But, you know, right to work is a really, really big deal. That is not something you want to violate as an employer, or having somebody working in a jurisdiction where they're not properly registered. So you've got engagement issues, you've got compliance issues, you've got career lifecycle management. What I see companies doing is developing policies to find that balance. Are they going to try to protect that space? Are they going to push people to return to office? And also trying to accelerate how their virtual programs work and how they're going to engage, and how their compliance programs are going to work. At the moment, it's a little bit messy. It's hard to sort out priorities. It's hard to get agreement on what programs meet the cultural, you know, objectives of the organization. What do they need? What do they not need? How flexible can they be? How do they make exceptions? So the best you can do, it's like being a parent. You got to be there for your client as they work through this. You got to coach them. You can give them advice in terms of, well, if you do this, these are the implications. If you do that, those are the implications. But in the end, to be honest with you, Bruce, and everyone who's on this call, I have not seen a packaged solution that answers more than just a few of these questions right now. We are absolutely still working it out. And by the time we stand up programs and solutions and catch up with the reaction, it would seem to me that governments will really start having their say, because remember, they're slightly behind the curve in reaction time. They've got more consensus to build. They've got more obstacles to get through as they move towards legislation. So by the time they start figuring this out, we are going to have to be ready to go back and adjust, which is a huge call for building agility into whatever systems we're creating today.
And I think that agility portion is really valuable too, because every company is going to have very different needs, right? So Andrea, of course, your workplace is probably a lot more flexible than, you know, the average Deloitte client would be, or Fragomen client would be, and, you know, is able to build off of that and create a system and a structure that works for your employees that's different than, you know, what a large MNC might be doing. So kind of jumping off that, one of our questions we have in the chat is related to training for new students in the workforce who need a lot of coaching, supervision, and oftentimes have a hard time receiving that in a virtual environment. I know personally, I participated in a hybrid internship, and it was a lot easier to, you know, go to the person next to me in the office and say, hey, can you help me out with this? Versus having to message them on Teams, schedule a call, show them the data, and like try to create a space for us to work was a lot more difficult. And so if you guys have seen any ways that new hires have been brought into the workforce? What does that virtual environment look like as far as training and boot camps go for new hires?
I can start. I think for us, we just revamped our new hire onboarding, right? So because we were growing so quickly and it's in this type of environment, we did have to get very creative about how we engage in making people feel like they were connected. So, one of the things we've done is, created a blended or mixed experience. So part of it is live on Zoom, or we use Google Meet. Part of it is recorded. There's also a detailed on-ramp plan that's sent with very purposeful individuals that everyone is set to meet with, along with check-ins 30, 60, and 90 days into the process, right? So part of that, and hence a lot of my role is setting that infrastructure to create a positive experience in this virtual environment. Now, I'd say from an overall kind of coachability and day-to-day work, I think it's a lot of it is you have to be very purposeful, right? As a leader, you may know or hopefully should know or be able to self-reflect, how much can you be there for a younger new hire, right? How can you make yourself very available, right? If you've just not done well with more of a spontaneous conversations, right? Being able to stop what you're doing and, take that call, take that Slack message, whatever it may be, you have to be self-aware and understand whether or not you have that type of leadership in you, right? Me purposely, I enjoy that, right? And for myself, as a leader, especially in this environment, I make myself available, whether it's every day at a certain time. You, Bruce, as an example, you have 30 minutes that's dedicated for you on my calendar, right? And you can tell me during the course of the day, do we need that time? Do we not need it? And I give you that space to really have my undivided attention, right? And at times it helps to then hold, any, questions. There's a little bit of joint accountability on both sides where the time, you should come prepared for that time. But then you get me for that period of time. That's always yours. It's not going to be scheduled over. And then we have a way to get to want to know one another, know our work styles, and be able to provide you that coaching every day in an informal yet formal setting, if that makes sense. So, we all do better at different things. I think, making yourself sometimes available for others is all they need, right? Just to know that somebody's there. And in this virtual environment, I think it's pretty critical. So that's just a tip I've used that I gathered over the last couple of years, because I was kind of working in a hybrid model at the time prior to COVID, where it just really helped to reassure those people who worked for me, you will get me every day. So don't feel like you're not going to. And it helped us both kind of logistically work through any issues as well during those days.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something very valuable, and students, as well as moving into the workforce, should try to create that environment, even if the company's not offering it, right? To try to find those coaches and mentors to be able to guide them through the workforce. Moving forward, I mentioned to panelists as well, or to the attendees as well, we're moving into the Q&A portion, and so I've been asking a few questions that people have been sending in. So feel free to pop any questions into the chat, and then we'll be able to pass them on to our panelists for these last few minutes here. So one of the questions that the students are often wondering about, and one of the questions in the chat kind of builds off of this, is when we're looking at the types of skills required, especially for a HR global mobility career and one in this new world where we have more remote options, what should students be looking for? We often hear advice about develop your soft skills, make sure that you're able to communicate well. What does that look like concretely for students? Because I think oftentimes we hear that advice, but don't really see a path forward. There's not a helpful course or sort of training that you can do. How do you develop those soft skills to be able to make an impact in the workforce? Or are there other skills graduates should be looking out for as well?
Should I, the first part of developing those skills is, so in no particular order, watching out for when you've made a mistake, recognizing those mistakes and learning from them. and you're going to make mistakes, particularly when it comes to communication. That's the area where most people are most likely to make a mistake. Watch body language. Think about what you've said. Think about how it was received. Apply a degree of empathy and ask yourself, was that the right way to communicate that particular point? Was this the right audience? Was that the right person to hear it in that particular way? And you don't need to do that after everything, every time you speak, of course. But if you're looking at a person's body language, and you get into the habit of always looking out for when body language adjusts in an awkward way or an uncomfortable way, you will recognize when you've made a mistake, and you can ask yourself that question. We talk about communication, and it is about writing a clear email in business language, and so on. It is about being able to present. It is about being able to sit on a panel or etc. But actually, more than anything, it's about listening to the people who are around you, understanding where they are, understanding what they need from you, and being able to communicate on that particular issue or problem. That's the start and end of all of it, really. The skills, problem solving skills, to be honest, you're going to have to find your own way, and the only way is to practice solving problems, and the best place will be in the workplace. But don't just. So the way that I was taught to solve problems in the Home Office is I was taught how to make policy, and you make policy using, we called it the policy wheel. You start at the top by looking at what are we trying to achieve. You move around to think about what's already in place. Where are the gaps? Is it that we already have a solution to this problem? If not, then you look at who can help me, where can I get more information? And you begin to think about your stakeholders, and you can prioritize those stakeholders according to their interest and importance. You can research too. Having worked around that wheel, you get round to deciding on the course of action, to implementation, and then review. And review means going back to first principles and your objectives and asking yourself whether or not you were there. If you were Google the policy wheel, or I'll send Bruce an article that I wrote not too long ago. But that is a discipline. The most important part of solving a problem is starting with what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and what is it that we are trying to achieve. The other, and then genuinely beyond that, once you're in the job, the most important skill, and I've said it so many times today, but it's listening and understanding what's needed of you, and then doing what's needed. And then the next important skill will be, when you aren't quite sure what you've been told, asking the person who's directing you, or asking a colleague. And as you become more advanced, you are more senior, one of the more important skills is being able to recognize when a person has no idea what they're being told, and you can say, it's okay, do you want me to be a little bit clearer, and so on. But it will be, anyway, sorry, that was slightly ranging, but it is communication. You're going to learn by getting it wrong, and problem solving, just go back to what you're trying to achieve in the first place, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of evaluating where, like you mentioned, where every stakeholder stands, and whether or not you're communicating to each one of them in a way that they're going to be more receptive to is incredibly valuable. And I think kind of, while we're wrapping up here, one of the questions we're being asked by Newport, I think, gets close to where, to a perspective that I would like to hear from each of you. So Nupur asks, I was wondering if panelists have any advice on how to stand out as an intern or new hire. And is there anything they've seen be really successful or not? And I'd be really interested to see how, each one of you from different industries have seen interns, new hires stand out, be successful, and become the kind of people who become successful, good, driven individuals. Starting with Scott, I would love to hear your perspective on this, and then go down the line.
Yeah, although I'm likely to borrow from my co-presenter's comments from earlier on. I mean, Andrea said something I thought was really important, which is especially important early on in your career. Don't say no. Don't have opinions about what this work is. It's new to you, right? You show up, you've gotten through all the filters, you got hired, you did well on your interview, and now you're here to work. say yes unless you're totally slammed and really have zero availability, but say yes, and say yes to different managers and supervisors, and be part of different teams, poke around a little bit, see what's going on. But the attributes are that you're leaning in, you're focused, you're listening, which is a super important thing that Ian said earlier. You're authentic about what you're interested in, what your limitations are. Another thing I just stole from Ian, you know, I think you're hearing the same thing. That's the stuff that makes us smile, is authenticity, commitment, know your limitations, ask for help when you need it. If you know something, like as a result of your own experiences and or your own studies, lean in, say what you know, make a contribution, don't be shy. I think in all the work we're doing, especially today, especially with all of the ambiguities that have been thrown our way as a result of the trends that we've talked about in this conversation, as leaders, we're super interested in diverse perspective on things. And you don't have to be in the business for 20 years to have a point of view. You could have just walked in the door and it's fine. So share your point of view and also have some humility about it. You know, don't say no, lean in, learn from others. If you do those things, then what we see is someone eager to learn, eager to develop, eager to progress. Nobody expects you to walk in the door as a new hire, even be here within the first 2 years and have outsized impact. There is an accumulation of knowledge and skill and experience. And when we talk about this thing of making mistakes, I'll just add that, for example, in the last couple of years, there have been, well, thankfully for many organizations, for many years, there have been robust discussions about diversity, equity, inclusion, and ability in the workplace. But for the last couple of years in particular, there's been more vibrant and more common conversation. Look, we're all clumsy at that, unless you've been in that space from a policy perspective. This is a great kind of reference point for how challenging work can be, and the fact that you need to lean in and practice, and you'll be clumsy, and it's okay. People will help you, right? That's an area that all of us, I think, had to develop quickly in.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrea, any thoughts on how interns and new hires can stand out?
Yeah, I would say, you know, be curious, ask questions. You know, similar to what Scott said, no one's expecting you to come in as an intern or new hire, having all the answers and understanding the business and having all the solutions, but ask those questions. And oftentimes it's those questions that are in your mind are perceived as silly or elementary or simple that can pull people out of making situations overly complex, you know, thinking through too much, too much decision by democracy, you know, just asking those basic questions and having that new view can make a difference, which inherently, again, goes to Scott's comment about, you know, diversity of thought and inclusion, right? You know, often mixed teams, mixed, you know, not only genders, but demographics, culture, thought, background make for the most productive teams. And that includes interns and new hires. And, you know, I'd say the other thing that I always look for is, are you hungry? Are you eager to learn, right? Are you willing to be kind of thrown in? I wouldn't maybe say quite the deep end, but maybe the middle of the pool. Are you ready to be thrown into the middle of the pool just to have that experience, you know, learn from it and get coaching along the way? I think is critically important. You need to show that you're coachable. You need to show that you're open. You also, again, should, as we talked about earlier, stand your ground of what you feel is fundamentally a value and an attribute of yourself, and how you take that maybe perception or view and change it into something positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you guys are all offering a wealth of advice on being driven, motivated, willing to ask questions. And some of the questions we're getting in the chat are students worried about working remotely and being engaged in that area. So Scott, do you have any thoughts on performance as a remote worker and what students can do to set themselves apart there?
Number one, if you're in a significantly different time zone as a result of your choice to work remotely, that's your choice. The employer's made an accommodation. You'll need to shift your time. There's no negotiating that, my point of view. Second, self-care is the number one recommendation I have for remote workers. It is really easy to be back-to-back on virtual calls all the time. You've got to protect your own well-being. Build in a little bit of time for a break or a lot of time for lunch or whatever it is. Look out for yourself. I have found that I'm working way harder in a remote work environment, way more hours than I ever did when I came into the office every day. My commute gave me time to get ready and time to decompress. I don't have that anymore. So look out for yourself. Then there are other tips and tricks that should be obvious, like get to know the technology and leverage it. Find applications that'll make you more effective as a presenter or more engaged as a team member.
Yeah, absolutely. And Andrea, you want to tackle that last question from Mana as well?
Yeah, so Mena, this is an intriguing question because if I'm inferring your comment correctly, there seems to be a concern about generations asking questions. Whether you're a millennial, a Gen Z, a Gen Y, to be blunt and frank, and I wanted to make sure we address this for you, Mena. If there's a feeling that no matter what the generation is, you can't ask a question, then that's not the right culture for you, right? Everyone has the ability and the right and the choice to ask questions, right? Sometimes we can be self-deprecating about it, like, oh, this is probably a silly question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, right? There's nothing worse, to Ian's point, of someone walking away from a conversation, no matter what age you are, no matter where you come from, and you have no idea what just happened. You have no idea what was asked of you. And frankly, lack of asking for that clarity, lack of asking almost reflects just as much on you as the communicator who is providing you the information. So, if there's this feeling that as maybe an individual of an older or different generation, not having the same luxury of Generation Z, I would question that culture as a way that you're going to be fruitful and successful.
Yeah.
If I could just really quickly add to that, where that's me and I've got an intern in front of me and I've given instructions on a project, if they, or any person who's early in their career, or anyone really, if they just sit there and say, and then walk out the office, I'll be sat there thinking, what just happened? Was I not clear? Were they not listening? Did they not care? It's that part of the art of communication is to communicate, frankly, and actually show that you're engaged and you're in the room. But I wanted to say as well, when we're asking about what's important if you're an intern, make sure that you show that you want to be there and not just anywhere. So it can't just be, oh yeah, well, I'd like a job when I finish university. I want to work for Deloitte because I want to work in mobility because I want to work, etc. Because otherwise, if I had two people and who are probably going to be at around the same level, and one really wants to be here and the other one seems quite nice but wants just to be somewhere, the first person is probably going to get the job, really. But anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks to all of you for coming here. I know we're a little bit over time, so I want to kind of wrap this up with a speed round question for each one of you, if we'll grant it. So in about 30, 60 seconds or so, what is one bad piece of advice you often hear given to students that you would like to rectify? I see an eager look from Scott, so I'll let you kick it off.
I was just so shocked by the question, Bruce. I'm not so sure a bad piece of advice. Engineer your presentation based on what you think the person wants to hear. The good advice is consider who you're talking to and present who you are in a way that you can communicate to that person. But don't bloat anything out. Don't make anything up. A good interviewer will always figure that out.
Great. Andrea, Ian?
Ian, I'm gonna let you go first.
Yeah, I was hoping that you would go first. Well, I was thinking the worst advice or the worst tendency I see is the feeling that you know better than your client, or you know better than the person who is in whatever context buying something from you. Because the moment you make that mistake, like you're going to sell that, it's going to go very badly. You've got to listen, you've got to learn, you've constantly got to do both of those things, or you go backwards, really.
Yeah, I think my then advice would say, you know, probably echoing some other messaging from me throughout this time together, is this ability to feel like you have to conform. You know, you obviously were brought into the company, they saw something in you. You know, of course, culture is a big deal, and an important thing right now, and will be going forward in many companies. But, you know, don't try and conform just to feel like you need to fit something. Individuals are valued, individuals are looked after with high regard, and, you know, no one wants a bobbing head in a meeting.
That's a great place to end on. Well, what a abundance of knowledge from each one of you. I really appreciate you bringing diverse perspectives to our student group and helping them see a path forward. So thanks to all of you, and thanks again to the Global Mobility Club for putting this event on. It was a great time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.